Welcome to Newport Presbyterian. We are delighted to be here to host the 14th Meekhof Lecture this evening. Delighted to welcome the Reverend John Fife that we will introduce in a moment. But let me take a minute to just tell you why it is that we do this lecture series every year. This is in memory of Doreen Meekhof, who was the wife of Newport's founding pastor, David Meekhof, who founded this church in 1960. Doreen had a deep commitment to faith in education and in social witness and in worship, and it is in her honor that we are able to welcome you here this evening and each year that we do this series. We will be here tonight for a lecture followed by a question and answer, and following that we will have coffee and some goodies provided for you out here in the atrium. Tomorrow morning we hope you will come back. The doors will open at 9 o'clock for a continental breakfast in the atrium with the lecture starting at 9:30. And then we hope you'll come back again on Sunday if you would like, because John will be preaching at both of our worship services. And those are at 8:45 and again at 11 o'clock. We know the Seahawks are playing during that time. Not great competition there for us. Again, and I am Janet DeWater, the pastor of the church. So again, it is my pleasure to welcome all of you here this evening. And my pleasure now to invite Gary Skinner to introduce our speaker for us.
Thank you, Janet. Our speaker this evening, as she has indicated, is the Reverend John Fife, a human rights activist and retired minister of the Southside Presbyterian Church in Tucson, Arizona. John was pastor at Southside for 35 years. And in my experience in the ministry, I have found that if anyone is a pastor of any church for 35 years, either he's among people who really love him or her, or else he has a hard time finding a job. In John's case, it was a case of a congregation that deeply appreciated him and his leadership. He came there when the Southside Presbyterian Church was not sure it wanted to continue. And for those of us who have been there for worship, it's a very, very wonderful and special experience because it reaches into a community that was at one time basically a Native American community. And then as things happened, it kind of gradually changed into becoming more of a Hispanic community. And at one time it had an African-American pastor. And then John came and they really had decided they couldn't continue it. And the Presbyterian said, no, we can't afford to have this church go. But through friends and so on, John was called and given a period of relative short time to say, let's see if we can make a go of it. And not only did he make a go of it, but the church is a wonderful congregation today, continuing to reach out to a very multicultural community and attracting people because of the church that it is from literally all across the country. On March 24th in 1982, Southside Presbyterian Church declared itself to be a sanctuary for Central American refugees. That same day in the San Francisco area, there were 5 other churches that declared themselves to be houses of sanctuary. And very soon, there were over 500 churches across the United States who had opened their doors and said, we will be a safe haven, we will be a sanctuary for those who were coming from Central America and fleeing, in many cases, for their lives. Some of those churches and synagogues were right here in the Seattle area. In 1982, shortly after this movement began, the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church acted to support these congregations and individuals who, as a way of showing compassion, were providing asylum to these individuals, to these people who were seeking relief and help as they were leaving the Central American countries. And at the same time, the General Assembly was saying to the church and speaking to the need for change in issues related to immigration. The General Assembly urged that other congregations be challenged to take on this matter and to adopt this stance. And so it was kind of interesting that just a year after that, after the movement had begun and our own national church had kind of blessed it, it's kind of interesting that in 1984, 1 year later, federal officials decided to start an undercover investigation of the growing sanctuary movement. And that undercover investigation involved people going into churches and, without being declared who they were sitting in on Bible study groups and prayer meetings and writing down license plates of those cars parked in the parking lots. And a year later, 11 people from Arizona and Mexico were arrested for allegedly violating federal law relating immigration. John was one of those persons arrested, and after a 6-month-long trial, he and 7 others were found guilty of violating the federal immigration laws. I'd like to step aside from the story from John to add a personal comment about that. I arrived in Phoenix, Arizona on January 3rd, 30 years ago, and I came there after 20 years in the Chicago area where I'd been involved in a few issues myself, like open housing marches, the riots on the west side of Chicago after Dr. King was assassinated, and engaged in organizing a group that was called Concerned Clergy for Problem Pregnancies. That was in the pro-Roe v. Wade days. Made a couple of trips to Central America, so I was familiar with the issues that were being dealt with there in the Southwest. We had our own Central American task force in Chicago Presbytery. So what was happening, I was a little familiar with, but I really came to Phoenix hoping after 20 years of those kinds of activities to have a little brief spell to catch my breath. The first morning that I went to work at my new position, there was a note on my desk that says, "There is a press conference at 10 o'clock this morning. Your church has filed suit against the United States Attorney General and the Immigration and Naturalization Service." And I said a little prayer that wasn't too complimentary to God, saying, this isn't quite the way it's supposed to work out. But it did. And it began a relationship with John. And within a few weeks after that first day in the office, Janet and I spent 2 days in the federal court in Tucson, Arizona, listening to John and the other defendants for the first time, explaining why they had engaged in the activity of providing shelter and care and asylum for those who are crossing the boundary from Central American countries up into the United States. More recently, John, with others, has organized and engaged himself in a new program known as No More Deaths. Again, a humanitarian effort to provide water and support for those whose lives are in danger as they cross the Sonoran Desert, seeking refuge in the United States. In 1992, John served as moderator of the Presbyterian Church, USA. And for those of you who are not Presbyterian and not familiar with what the moderator of the General Assembly is or does, well, let me simply say that the moderator is expected to moderate a meeting of the General Assembly, which involves about 700 Presbyterians, and anybody that would be dumb enough to take on that job really deserves a great deal of the Lord. I can't imagine what it is to have 700 Presbyterians arguing with each other for 5 or 6 consecutive days. But John mercifully took that on, was elected, and did an outstanding job. Last night, in talking with John, I learned that while moderator, when he was asked to itinerate around the United States and elsewhere, he asked those who arranged his overnight lodging that whenever it was possible, he wanted to be kept overnight in a homeless shelter sponsored by the host church whenever possible. When I heard that, it sort of said to me all that I need to say about the dedication of John Fife as a follower and disciple of our Lord Jesus Christ. And so, John, deeply grateful to welcome you as a friend, as a colleague in ministry, to the Newport Presbyterian Church, and to the many friends who are here this evening. Welcome.
That's the most generous introduction I've ever received. I was invited to go back to my seminary, Rob's seminary too, during the 1980s when we were doing sanctuary for Central American refugees. And part of the responsibility of that time, the president asked me to preach at chapel. And he introduced me something like this. He said, there have been many distinguished graduates of this fine seminary. And he started naming cathedral pastors and distinguished theological professors and on and on and on. He said, our guest preacher this morning, John Fife, is not one of those distinguished graduates of this institution. He's one of the more notorious. You'll understand when you hear him speak. So you're properly warned in the light of Gary's generous introduction. I want to thank Newport Presbyterian Church for your invitation to join this weekend in the David and Doreen Meekhof Lectures. Thanks to the committee members who tolerated my procrastination in getting information to them about this evening. And no thanks to the Seattle Seahawks for thumping the Arizona Cardinals last weekend. We'll try to rectify that somewhere in the near future. And I haven't even started and I'm being booed already. I deeply appreciate your invitation because Seattle and Tucson have been closely linked for decades in the struggle for justice for refugees and migrant workers. The two cities are strategically placed at the northern and southern borders. As a result, our faith communities and cities have been in close relationships for a long time, and it's good to be back. I didn't even get in the door before Sister Louise greeted me to welcome me back to Seattle. University Baptist Church here in Seattle was an essential link in the new Underground Railroad in the 1980s, moving Central American refugees who were at the highest risk to Canada because Canada respected international law and would resettle those folks we could get to a port of entry as refugees. And a Unitarian church here received a family from Guatemala into sanctuary at a critical time in the movement. And the Archbishop of Seattle welcomed the family to Seattle at a rally in the cathedral when we arrived. So I have very warm feelings for y'all. I could go on and on about those treasured relationships, but one story will have to do. The pastor at University Baptist Church then was a man by the name of Donovan Cook, and a great friend. At some point, I think in 1984, one of our colleagues in Texas, Jack Elder, was arrested and charged with several felonies for his work in protecting Central American refugees then. And so a number of us were asked to come and testify at a hearing before the trial started about how this was essential to Jack's faith, and it was a First Amendment issue, and we brought in Christian ethicists and theologians from around the country to testify. And Donovan was one of those testifying. And the prosecutor, in cross-examining Donovan, said, Mr. Cook, you're a Baptist minister, is that right? And Donovan said, yes, of course. He said, and Baptists believe in the Bible, or is that right? Donovan said, yes, of course, we Baptists believe in the Bible. And the prosecutor said, well, I'm a Baptist too, and I've looked through the whole Bible. And he said, Mr. Elder here is charged with transporting, and I can't find anything in my Bible that says anything about transporting. I don't understand how you're here defending Mr. Elder. And Donovan looked at him and smiled and said, well, yeah, you remember the story of the Good Samaritan, don't you? And the prosecutor said, yes. And he said, and if you're a Baptist, you think that's God's word, don't you? And the prosecutor said, yes, Mr. Cook. And Donovan said, well, you remember the story. This man is waylaid along the road, half beaten to death. And a priest walks by and passes on by on the road, and then a Levite passes by on the road, and then this Samaritan comes along, and he tends to the man, binds up his wounds, puts him on his donkey, and transports him to the nearest inn. Donovan said, that's transporting, and the prosecutor sat down. So when Newport Presbyterian contacted me about this lecture, Dory Yang said you needed the titles for the lectures and a description by the end of last summer. I replied that, well, I could do that, but 5 months and critical events could change everything. What I sent for the brochure could be way out of date and totally irrelevant by the time we got to January. But since then, more than 1 million refugees from the wars and conflicts in the Middle East have crossed into the European Union, Europe's largest refugee migration since World War II. And Donald Trump announced his candidacy for President of the United States by declaring that alien Mexican immigrants, quote, have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems to us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, unquote. He then promised to build a great wall the length of the border, and Mexico would pay for it. Pundits have declared that national security and immigration will be the top 2 issues in the presidential campaign in 2016. Oh, and by the way, Trump then called for a total immigration ban on Muslims after the San Bernardinos and Paris shootings. And President Obama issued an executive order that potentially protected 4 million migrant workers from deportation. And that order was quickly stayed by the courts and is now before the Supreme Court. And 27 governors of states have barred Syrian refugees from being resettled in their states. God bless Washington, your governor did not do that. And just after Christmas, it was disclosed that ICE would begin nationwide raids to deport Central American women and small children. So, this time together this evening might be relevant after all. Migration as challenge to the church. Indeed. This moment, I would hope, is and will be especially relevant to people of faith, even Presbyterians. The Bible is consistent and clear on the issue before us this evening. How must we treat, relate to, migrants and refugees as individuals and as a nation? The entire biblical text is consistent and clear. God commands the people of faith to love the migrant, alien, stranger. No exceptions. No exceptions. The biblical narrative begins with migrants and God-led migration. Quick survey. Adam and Eve are exiled from the garden. Abraham and Sarah are told by God to go from your country and your kinfolk to the land that I will show you. And know this for certain, that your descendants shall be aliens in a land that is not theirs. And then the great Exodus narrative from slavery across the desert to the promised land. And 17 times in the Torah, God commands the people to love the alien in their midst. Leviticus 19 is clear. When an alien resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the alien. You shall love the alien as yourself. Remember, you were once aliens in the land of Egypt. Rabbi colleague of mine, Rabbi Weizenbaum, said to me, John, in the entire Torah, it only says once you have to love your neighbor as yourself. He said, that's because God knew we could get that. But in the Torah, it says 17 times you have to love the alien and treat the alien justly that is in your midst. The rabbi said, that's because God knew we would struggle with that one. So we have. All the prophets remember Torah and recall Israel to keep covenant, even when Israel is in exile. And then the gospel writers reveal that the birth story of Jesus is in the context of a journey, a migration, and a flight of Joseph and Mary and Jesus as refugees into Egypt, fleeing the persecution of King Herod. And during his ministry, Jesus crosses borders again and again to include strangers and Samaritans and Gentiles and Syrophoenician women even, in his proclamation of the birth of the kingdom of God. And then Jesus tells us how God will judge our faithfulness in our time. As you do it to the least of these, the hungry, the thirsty, the naked, the sick, the imprisoned, and the alien. As you did it to the least of these, you do it to me. And the crucified, dead, and buried Jesus appears to disciples fleeing Jerusalem on the road to Emmaus as an alien stranger, and is revealed in their hospitality to this alien, the breaking of bread. Migration is challenge to the church. So to explore that question, I'd like to begin a long time ago, over 500 years ago, with the perspective of a colleague in Sanctuary, Dr. Gary McCoyne. He writes this: 5 centuries ago, Europe broke out of its encirclement by Islam, when Columbus's search for a new route to India was blocked by a continent he didn't know was there. It was the start of a process, a devastating process for parts of what we call the Third World. The first stage involved 2 elements: the destruction of the Aztec, Mayan, and Inca cultures, and the annihilation of 90% of the estimated 70 million inhabitants of the American continent. Let me say it again. We wiped out 90% of the indigenous peoples of this continent. And a parallel exploration of the continent's riches. Records in Spain's Archives of the Indies list 185,000 tons of gold and 16 million tons of silver unloaded at one Spanish port between 1503 and 1660. From the beginning of this process, the church has played a vital role in blessing and justifying that conquest. Already in 1493, Pope Alexander VI, beginning with the theological assumption that the Pope was the owner of all lands not ruled by Christian monarchs, donated all of the newly discovered land to the Spanish crown. The reason the Pope wrote was to ensure, quote, that the Catholic faith be the more greatly exalted in our time, and that we seek the salvation of souls, and that the barbarian nations be dismantled and subjugated to the same faith, unquote. My own European Protestant ancestor, Sister Louise, I'm not picking on the Catholics here. My own European Protestant ancestors justified conquest and genocide with a different but equally devastating theology. They saw themselves as the new Israel, to whom God had given this promised land in order to establish a Christian nation. Later, that same theology became the doctrine of the manifest destiny of the United States, that the U.S. was elected by God to govern the entire North American continent, no matter the cost. Those same Protestant ancestors developed an apocalyptic theology that said that only when the United States ruled all of the continent from Panama to the Canadian border would the second coming of Jesus occur. Challenge to the church? Knowing the history of immigration policy and law and this border is critical to understanding the current context we find ourselves in. Let me briefly sketch that history for us. The themes are consistent. The southwest border is established when the United States declared the annexation of Texas and sent troops to the Rio Grande in 1846. The President of the United States then promised in his election campaign that if he were elected, he would invade Mexico, and he did. A full-scale war and invasion of Mexico resulted in two treaties in 1848 and 1853 that established the present border. The United States annexed 55% of Mexico's territory. What today are the states of Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Wyoming, Colorado, Kansas, Utah, Nevada, and California. Between 1875 and 1918, the first immigration laws are passed, giving the federal government the authority to regulate immigration. Until 1875, all the legislation that had been enacted to encourage and support immigration, we needed people to fill the continent. Those first laws were passed so that, quote, lunatics, convicts, polygamists, professional beggars, and anarchists, and those suffering from a loathsome disease, and women for the purpose of prostitution, unquote, are barred from entry to the United States. Chinese Exclusion Act is passed in 1882 because the great fear among Americans is that all of China will migrate across the Pacific. Of course, that fear quickly gave way to the ambivalence that marks the entire history of immigration policy when Chinese labor became essential for the building of the Western railroads. In 1917, that same fear and racism reasserted itself in legislation banning anyone from all of Asia and the Pacific Islands from entry into the United States. Border Patrol is not established until 1924, the first federal enforcement on the southwest border. Of course, people had migrated freely back and forth across this border for generations. Over 1 million Mexicans had fled north during the decade of the Mexican Revolution and the violence from it. Since Prohibition was policy then in the 1920s, the primary function of the Border Patrol then was to keep demon rum and tequila from crossing the border, not people. My Protestant ancestors were hard at work legislating quotas for particular nationalities during that time, especially the Catholic countries of Southern Europe and Ireland. The fear was that the Pope was plotting to take over the United States through immigration. Remember, the Ku Klux Klan had two goals. One was to maintain segregation and Jim Crow, and the other was to stop all immigrants from Southern Europe and Ireland. Great Depression, like all economic recessions, resulted in harsh anti-immigrant legislation and anti-Mexican sentiment. The southwest border is locked down during the Depression, and hundreds of thousands of persons of Mexican descent, whether they're United States citizens or not, are rounded up at gunpoint and deported. Then in 1942, the policy reverses 180 degrees when the United States goes to war. The Bracero program, a guest worker program, is enacted to encourage migration in order to support agriculture and war-related industry up and down the California West Coast. The Bracero program continues to be vital to post-war economic growth and is not ended until the recession of 1964. Donald Trump, in some of his campaign speeches, has hearkened back to the 1950s under President Eisenhower, when during a similar recession, Eisenhower rounded up and instructed federal agents to deport all undocumented Mexicans. It was called, amazingly enough, Operation Wetback. Trump points to that as the predecessor to what he would like to do if elected president. What Mr. Trump needs to do is read the history of that moment in American history, because Eisenhower did start Operation Wetback, and the media covered the deportation of all those Mexicans out of the fields and back to Mexico. It took the agricultural industry and the growers and the farmers about a week to get Eisenhower's ear. And he couldn't stop. It was a very popular program for deportation. So what to do? Well, what they did was they sent all kinds of State Department and Labor Department emissaries to Mexico to meet the trains and the buses carrying the deportees, give them all a temporary visa, turn them around, and send them back so we could get the crops out of the fields. Mr. Trump needs to remember. But during this entire time since World War II, a major dependency has been established in the economies of both the United States and Mexico, dependent upon the ability of workers to migrate to support their families and to support our economic needs. With the end of guest worker visas, a new phenomenon occurs. With a wink and a nod of both governments, Mexican workers jump the border, go to work, and then migrate back to their families. During this period, the average stay of a migrant worker in the United States was 2 years, according to Labor Department studies. Since we built the wall, it's now a permanent stay, isn't it? We haven't kept out migrant workers, but we sure have walled them in, haven't we? During this time, of course, not everyone migrated back to Mexico after World War II. About a quarter of migrant workers settled down in the United States, got married, established families, and got permanent jobs. The United States recognized the need for legal status, and about every 12 years established what we called, as a nation, a registration, whereby undocumented workers could register and get a green card and continue to pursue citizenship. 1974 and 1986 were the last 2 years for such a program. In a political deal, President Reagan agreed for the first time in history to enact employer sanctions in exchange for an amnesty, what members of his party called an amnesty, for 3 million migrants. Challenge to the church? The themes from that history are evident. Racism has been a consistent theme, from the Asiatic exclusion to Southern Europeans to Mexicans. Economic expansion and depression dictate immigration policy. Fear of the other alien stranger is woven throughout our history. Challenge to the church? Well, except for the devastating period of conquest and plunder and genocide by the empires of Europe on this continent, and the devastating period of conquest, plunder, slavery, and genocide by the emerging American empire of manifest destiny, we, the church, have had significant moments of being authentically faithful. Between 1820 and 1924, the United States welcomed and absorbed more than 30 million immigrants, the largest migration in human history. Those European migrants brought their faith history with them and built churches and schools and social welfare institutions that were, for the most part, faith-based. Y'all know about Scotch-Irish Presbyterian colleges and seminaries and universities. Neighborhoods in the burgeoning cities became identified with nationalities and faith traditions. Settlement houses for newly arrived immigrants were established by all denominations to teach English, educate women, teach skills, and organize tenements. Schools and colleges were established by all the denominations long before there were land-grant universities. I was gently informed when I spoke recently at Boston College that that great institution was founded because Catholics could not be admitted to Harvard or Yale. It is evident that the church or synagogue was at the very heart of every migrant community during the century of the Great Migration, providing pastoral care, education, hospitals, social services, colleges, and a center for faith and community and culture. We do not have time to discuss the essential role of the church in union organizing to end child labor and sweatshops and exploitation. So let me mention some other moments of authentic ministry in the more recent history of immigration. After World War II, with the arrival of migrant agricultural workers in the Bracero program, the church did respond with a proliferation of migrant ministries. The abuses of migrant workers, low pay, hazardous work, pesticides, lack of medical care, decrepit housing, lack of education for children, all have been well documented. The church responded in meeting basic needs through migrant ministries. Although almost all those efforts were designed to meet the social welfare needs of the migrants, communities of faith were formed in the fields. The very beginning of organizing efforts began to take shape. Even though it was conventional wisdom that migrant and undocumented workers could not be organized, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta began a farm workers' union. The church was an essential factor in that movement deemed impossible to achieve. Farm workers' masses became the rallying center for union organizing, and the faith of workers became the strength of that movement. Fasting and nonviolence were the ethical and spiritual core. Churches across the nation became the organizing base for boycotts of grapes. The church had moved from charity to justice. Vital move. Another moment in recent history in which the church has played a vital role continues after 50 years. The community organizer by the name of Saul Alinsky, faced with organizing the poorest slums and ghettos of the south side of Chicago, had the insight that the only stable institutions left in those poverty-stricken neighborhoods were churches and schools. They would become the social base for organizing communities to gain influence and power to change lives and neighborhoods in those cities. These community organizations have made major changes in urban areas across the country, and churches have provided essential funding and leadership training and centers for organizing. The church is moving from charity to organizing for justice among the poor. Now I would like to return to the borderlands of the 1980s and a movement of faith communities we called Sanctuary, and to some lessons we learned from that time. The crisis on the border in 1980 was very different from the current life and death crisis on the border in the Southwest. In 1980, we began to learn that refugees from the death squads and torture and massacres of villages in El Salvador and Guatemala were beginning to arrive at our border. The United States government refused to recognize them as refugees, and thousands upon thousands were being arrested and imprisoned and deported in handcuffs back to the death squads and torture and massacres and wars of Central America. The church on both sides of the border began to respond in ministry to the needs of the refugees in ways you would expect: food and shelter and medical care and legal aid. Refugees were enabled by church volunteers to apply for political asylum. They were then represented at hearings by lawyers funded by the Tucson Ecumenical Council. But by 1981, we were dismayed to learn that no one from El Salvador or Guatemala was being granted political asylum by immigration judges. You see, the United States government was in political, military, and economic support of the regimes that were ordering the repression. So our allies could not be creating refugees. We were bringing democracy and development to Central America. You see how that turned out. My colleague Jim Corbett, a brilliant Quaker and rancher in the borderlands, defined the ethical challenge to the church clearly. He pointed to two examples in history. The first was the abolition movement, when churches and people of faith formed an underground railroad to help escaped slaves cross state borders safely and move north to safety. Second was the failure of the church in Europe to protect Jewish refugees fleeing the Holocaust. He told me, "I don't see how we can allow that failure on our border in our time." And so a few of us began to smuggle refugees safely across the border and hide them in homes in Tucson. And it didn't take long to run out of room in homes, and the church that I served as pastor began to take in refugees to sleep on the floor of the church. It also didn't take long, about 8 months, for the Border Patrol to discover our smuggling organization. They sent us a message: "We know what you're doing, stop it or we'll indict you on felony charges." So primarily in self-defense, we decided that the only course we had was to go public before we were indicted by declaring Southside Presbyterian Church to be a sanctuary for refugees from Central America. 4 other churches joined us on March 24th, 1982, and much to our astonishment, a movement began. Protestant churches, Catholic parishes and monasteries, Jewish synagogues, Quaker meetings began to declare sanctuary and protect refugees within their community of faith. What became to be known as a new underground railroad moved refugees safely from the border to sanctuaries across the country and on to Canada if they were at highest risk. And then a German church declared sanctuary and was joined by other churches in Europe. What originated in communities of faith then became appropriated by governments and universities as well. 17 cities, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, were the largest. They became cities of sanctuary, and still are today. New Mexico became a state of sanctuary, and colleges and universities joined the movement in the tradition of the free university. Stanford University was the first. A movement was born. So as Gary said, the government made a decision in 1984 to destroy the sanctuary movement. The FBI and Immigration Service infiltrated sanctuary churches with undercover agents and paid informants, pretending to be volunteers with crucifixes around their necks. They secretly recorded worship services, conversations with pastors, prayer meetings in church, and this was the first time in American history that the government had admitted sending government spies into churches without a warrant. In 1980, well, we knew they were doing it during the Civil Rights Movement, we just never could prove it. In 1985, 16 people were indicted and charged with various felonies. 2 Catholic priests, 3 nuns, the director of the Tucson Ecumenical Council, myself, and various Quaker, Unitarian, and other church volunteers. Since the federal judge ruled before the trial that we could say nothing in our defense about international refugee law, United States refugee law, conditions in Central America, or religious faith, we did not put on a defense and were found guilty. But the first defendant to be sentenced was Sister Darlene Nagorski. And she was told by the judge that, "I will be lenient in your case, sister." She would be sentenced to 5 years probation on the condition that she not have anything more to do with this sanctuary movement. Sister Darlene looked the judge right in the eye and said if the judge let her walk out of that courtroom, she would have to go back and help refugees in sanctuary. It was her faith. "Make up your mind, Judge," she said. "What do you want to do?" And after a brief recess, the judge returned and sentenced Sister Darlene to 5 years probation and said, "Take it up with your probation officer." Along with all the rest of the defendants, Darlene returned to the vocation of sanctuary for refugees. Determined to take the legal offensive, the sanctuary movement filed a civil suit against the Attorney General of the United States for violations of refugee law by continuing to deport refugees back to El Salvador and Guatemala. And that's when Gary got the call. After 3 years of legal maneuvering, the Justice Department settled the suit by agreeing to stop all deportations to El Salvador and Guatemala, and to give all persons from those countries temporary legal status and review of their political asylum claims. Another civil suit on behalf of the church resulted in a federal court judgment that the infiltration of the churches by government agents without a warrant had been a violation of the First Amendment free exercise of religion clause. One of our 2 lead attorneys on that case was a lawyer from Phoenix by the name of Janet Napolitano, who later became Secretary of Homeland Security. Last time I saw her, Janet asked me, "John, are you angry with me?" And I swore. I said, "You're damn right I'm angry with you, Janet. What did you expect?" What did we learn from the decade of sanctuary? Let me suggest 4 enduring lessons. First, that the church and synagogue can be an effective community base for active, nonviolent resistance to government violations of human rights. We were successful. Second, that the church has a responsibility to protect the victims of human rights violations, both legally and morally. We called it civil initiative, the legal right and ethical responsibility to protect the victims of human rights violations when government is the violator. When we declared Southside Church a sanctuary, I thought we were practicing civil disobedience. The government had threatened to indict us, so that was my assumption. Call from a human rights attorney turned that misconception around. He said to me, "You're not doing civil disobedience, it's the government that's violating United States refugee law, not you." Third, that the church is a global institution capable of forming effective relationships to protect the poor and persecuted across all national borders. We are a transnational institution, and we need to operate like one. Fourth, that by entering into protective community with the poor, the church becomes spiritually transformed itself. The sanctuary churches in North America did provide a safe place for refugees to speak the truth to power. But the poor of Central America taught us how to read the Bible through their eyes and through the experience of a persecuted and martyred church. Only God knows how many lives were saved by the sanctuary movement, but it is clear that the refugees saved the soul of countless churches and even Presbyterians in North America. We needed all of those lessons and experiences from the border and from church history as the current crisis on the southwest border began in 1994. During the recession of the early 90s, politicians found anti-immigrant and illegal alien rhetoric to be very popular. Does that sound familiar? In response, the Clinton administration began a new border enforcement strategy that was designed to look tough on immigration. In various sectors of the border, it was called Operation Hold the Line, Operation Rio Grande, Operation Gatekeeper, or Operation Safeguard. 16-foot high steel walls were built across the urban areas of the border. And the number of Border Patrol agents and vehicles and technology was quadrupled to seal off those urban areas from migration. Historically, almost all immigrants crossed the border in those urban areas. They were familiar and easily accessible with a largely Hispanic population in the border communities. And then the strategy called for border enforcement to be extended outward from those urban areas. The strategy was designed to force the migration of workers into increasingly isolated and hazardous areas of the border where migrants would face the extreme elements of desert and mountain. When the word gets out about how life-threatening and hazardous the crossing is, the Border Patrol forecast, that will be a deterrent to others trying to cross, and thereby we will gain control of the border. The plan called for enforcement to be initiated in Texas and California because the Immigration Service believed that the Sonora Desert of Arizona would be, in their words, a geographic barrier to migration. No one would try to cross through the deadly desert. As you know, that strategy has been a tragic failure for two reasons. First, the designers of the strategy never understood the desperation of poverty in Mexico and Central America. The United States government had no concept that the poor would risk everything, even their very lives, to feed their hungry children. Second, the strategy was implemented in 1994, the very same year that the North American Free Trade Agreement was implemented. In fact, there is a direct correlation between the two. Despite the utopian predictions of the advocates of free trade, realists knew that free trade would devastate the small and subsistence farmers and the poor of Mexico. The World Bank reports that over 3 million small farmers were driven off the land in Mexico because of NAFTA. These small farmers had nowhere to work to feed their families, and so it became necessary to risk everything in a border crossing to find work in the United States. Since 1994, over 7,000 poor migrants, men and increasingly women and children, have died cruel deaths in our desert and the mountains of the borderlands. And for the past 15 years, Arizona has been the epicenter of the deaths and suffering. Challenge to the church? As faith communities in Arizona, in 2000, as migrants began dying in the Sonoran Desert, we pulled together folks from both sides of the border who had been part of the sanctuary movement to struggle with the question of faith and ethics in this new crisis. An organization called Humane Borders was formed to put water tanks out in the critical areas of the desert where deaths were mounting. And countless lives have been saved by these water stations marked by a blue flag above the desert vegetation. 2 years later, Samaritans was organized to put four-wheel drive vehicles out in the remote back roads of the desert. Each day, volunteer doctors and nurses and EMTs and Spanish speakers from Tucson take food and water and emergency medical gear to the desert. They have found hundreds upon hundreds of migrants suffering from heat stroke, dehydration, broken limbs, twisted joints, heart attacks, strokes, and rattlesnake bites. They have rescued the victims of rape and beatings, the lost and the abandoned. 2 years later, in 2004, No More Deaths was organized to put a 24-hour-a-day presence in volunteers in camps in the desert. Volunteers leave camp each morning to hike the migrant trails with backpacks filled with food and water and first aid gear. Volunteers come from all over the United States and some even globally to be trained and work out of those camps. Water supplies and food are placed on the trails by No More Deaths volunteers, and a medical treatment facility has been established in the desert, a hospital tent from the war surplus of the Iraq War. And now the International Red Cross has partnered with us in those camps in the desert. The stories from the desert camp are legion, but just one will have to do under our time constraints. As our volunteers hike the migrant trails each day, they call out in Spanish, "We have food, we have water, do you need medical care? Don't be afraid, we are from the church." One morning, as a group of volunteers topped a ridge, they saw a group of about 20 migrants in the canyon below. And they called out to them in that way, and our volunteers could see the migrants gathering to talk and then start up the trail toward them. When the migrants were closer, the man in front called out, "We're out of food and only have a little water, but we'll share what we have." I tell you, that's the most Christian act I've ever seen in my life in the church. 2 years later, No More Deaths organized an aid station at the border crossing in Nogales, Sonora, in partnership with the government of Mexico to provide food and water and medical care for migrants being deported by the United States back to Mexico. And as volunteers talked with deported migrants, stories of abusive treatment while in the custody of Border Patrol began to unfold. The documentation project has resulted in over 14,000 interviews with migrants, which demonstrate systemic abuses of basic human rights by our Border Patrol. Deprivation of food and water in detention, physical and verbal abuse, separation of families through deportation to separate regions of the border. 2 years later, the Diocese of Tucson, the Diocese of Hermosillo, and the Jesuits founded Kino Border Initiative in Nogales, Sonora, which provides hot meals and clothing and medical care for recently deported migrants in increasingly effective ways. This ministry is replicated by the church in border cities from Tijuana to Matamoros. Since 1994, some conclusions can be reached about this tragically failed border enforcement strategy and immigration policy. The border enforcement policy has failed to secure the border. Politicians on both the left and the right seem to agree on that, at least in the United States. Migration has remained constant or increased each year since 1994, with the only decreases occurring during the U.S. recessions of 2000 and 2008. The border enforcement strategy is a violation of human rights and international law. A 6-judge panel of the Inter-American Court ruled unanimously as far back as 2003 that the United States is in violation of human rights by continuing a border enforcement strategy that has resulted in the deaths of thousands of migrants. This conclusion has since been affirmed by the UN Commission on Human Rights, Amnesty International, and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. The European Union has, during that same time, used the Mediterranean Sea for a similar purpose. Despite its failure and violations of international law, this border strategy continues because of the politics of fear and racism so prevalent in the United States. Migrant workers and their families are termed illegals and criminals. Recent candidate for Senate from Arizona said, quote, "These people don't come here to work. They come here to rob and deal drugs. We need the National Guard to clean up our cities and round them up. They have no problem slitting your throat and taking your money or raping your daughter, and they are evil people," unquote. The Obama administration has been the most devastating administration in United States history toward immigrant communities and families. ICE raids and the cooperation of local law enforcement have resulted in record numbers of deportations, 2.2 million to date. Mothers and fathers of United States citizen children are being disappeared and deported from our communities and churches. What a devastating figure. It's 800,000 mothers and fathers of United States citizen children. Again, this has been determined to be a violation of human rights and international law. Now, ICE agents are conducting raids again, the beginning of this month, against Central American mothers and children who have been fleeing the violence there in Central America. We'll take that subject up again tomorrow morning. One more story. A guy named Luis was picked up by the police in a traffic stop because the taillight was out on his car. Because he had no documents, he was turned over to ICE agents and deported. Luis had been working as a dishwasher in an upscale Phoenix restaurant for 11 years. His body was found in the desert last August. Luis died trying to get back to his wife and 3 children, 9 years old, 5 years old, and 7 months. Challenge to the church? We have evolved from charity to advocacy to justice in some of our ministries. And humanitarian aid to migrants on both sides of the border is essential to saving lives and relieving suffering. These ministries must continue and expand as the death toll rises on our border. The church